still cannot believe that she managed to do it.
Yeah,
Like
I
seriously.
cannot, because the stories that my friend told me, guys there, they are not safe, like soldiers in
Who
groups, and they
stay
get
there?
killed like this. And she managed to do all that as a woman. I mean, there, because it's completely, rape. I mean, and she's not from there, so I have no idea how did she manage that. Oh
Yeah.
my god.
She's a badass. She's such a badass.
Tomb
I swear.
Raider. She's Tomb Raider. What's her name? Angelina Jolie. She.
Where?
It's Tomb
And,
Raider movie.
ah,
Tomb Raider. What's called?
You just married Angelina Jolie with Tom Brady, the guy
no.
that plays football?
No, Tom
Tomb
Raider.
Raider.
Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider.
Oh, okay.
No,
Tomb
no,
Raider.
not
Tomb Raider.
Tomb Raider. I don't know what's the name.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about the football.
No, not
Ah.
Tom. No, 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 no.
I was like, don't mention
Yes.
that.
Yes, Jordan
He was
Tomb
roasted.
Raider.
He was roasted.
Welcome back to Fractured, our podcast by Refocus Media Lab citizen journalists, where we cover topics related to so-called refugee crisis, human movements, everything that is related to this topic. And today we have a very, very, very difficult topic that we will tell you about in a second. But welcome, Rashid, my co-host, as always, on his
Thank
position.
you. I'm back again. I'm still alive for
Yes. We have a fantastic guest today with us in the studio. Jordan Siegel, welcome.
now. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Jordan is a photojournalist and a filmmaker focusing on refugees, social and political issues throughout the MENA region. This passion brought her to Iraq, Afghanistan, Darfur, and many other places. And Darfur and Sudan is what we would like to talk to Jordan today. Sudan at this moment is not covered in Western media much, almost at all. But this is where probably the worst humanitarian crisis of our times is happening. Jordan has been there, reported. She is in the process of preparing her movie about the situation there, about certain individuals who struggled in this wartime. So, Jordan, it is such a complex issue because I feel like here in Europe we are we're always looking into ourselves, like our problems. We believe that the big refugee crisis is happening here in Europe, which is not true. So can we start with some short history of those Sudan conflicts? Can you lead us through, of course, in a short way, because I'm sure we can talk about it for hours, but can you tell us how did this situation that we are in started?
Right. Yeah, it is very complex. There's many different elements to the war that we see right now in Sudan. But to really understand the history and the dialogue of what is happening now, we go back into 1956 when Sudan gained their independence from the UK and Egypt. So before they gained their independence, Sudan was controlled by the UK in the south, which the UK controlled Darfur area, and those were made up by tribalism groups. And then Egypt controlled the north, where Khartoum and where the major cities are. And that was a population of Arab Muslims. And when Sudan gained their independence, it was an independent sovereign state, which means it's ruled by one ruler, controlling many different sectors of the government. It went into a civil war because Sudan was originally getting their economic growth through cotton production. So that transition into stabilizing their own economy and their own industry didn't really go well with the transition of government. And that what sparked a lot of the civil war at that time there was not enough resources. The agriculture was very low. They didn't know how to create a high resourceful agriculture. They didn't have a great economic industry to regrow from the cotton production that the elites were gaining from. And they also went into this kind of neo-colonialism type of government, which then, over time, when they established some sort of democracy, or we're heading into a democracy, or the government was establishing, a union-based government or a democratic-based government, there is always a military coup. So military coups have happened throughout Sudan's history, and that's what we saw, in the early 2000s, and then also in 2020. And it's time and time again, sorry, not 2020, but it was in 2021.
Sure.
But time and time again, we see military coups happen. And it's the same patterns as before. So this is kind of what Sudan has always faced.
Mm. If you could bring us now to current times and this horrible conflict that is going on for a bit more than a year now, so many people displaced inside Sudan, outside. Can you tell us a little bit of the basis of this conflict and bring us a little bit of the main characters of the conflict?
So the conflict is really between two military generals. It's Al-Burhan and Hemeti. And Al-Burhan controls the Sudanese armed forces, and Hemeti controls the Rapid Support Forces, the RSFs. It's very complex to really know these characters, to know how powerful they are. We have to go way back into when they were working under al-Bashir, and how they were actually able to regain their power and strength in order to create this civil war amongst each other in order to gain control of Sudan. When al-Bashir was when al-Bashir was in power, they had the Janjaweeds, and the Janjaweeds were, in translation, in Arabic, is devil on horseback, right? And they would go into these villages and they would just burn down these villages to the ground. They would take away their agriculture. They would kill their livestock. They would rape their women. And when the ICC was charging al-Bashir for war crimes, he decided to take the Janjaweeds and transition into the Rapid Support Forces in order to create these loopholes so that they wouldn't be charged for war crimes. And so that it was controlled by Hemeti. And then you had Al-Burhan, who controls the Sudanese armed forces. And he gathered basically a Muslim Brotherhood army because Al-Burhan, like al-Bashir, followed the caliphate. And so he created this Muslim Brotherhood army that would fight against South Sudan. So he wasn't really a part of the genocide that was going on in the early 2000s. But what we saw was that he was kind of taking his time. He was very smart and patient in order to really kind of make his army grow even stronger than the Rapid Support Forces. So when al-Bashir was ousted out of power, the media made it, well, it was sort of due to civilian pressure, but it wasn't really due to all civilian pressure. What really happened was that Al-Burhan and Hemeti said, hey, we're signing with the civilians here in Sudan. And so when they decided to back up the civilians, al-Bashir said, okay, I'm out. And Omar al-Bashir then was ousted out of power in 2019. And then afterwards, a new president came in, Abdullah Hamdok. And he was the first, he wasn't the first, but he was the one that started to kind of bring democracy to the horizon. He was the ruler of the civilian council. But he wasn't getting any kind of international support to release them from so much debt that they were in because of the civil war that they were facing for so many years. And the Al-Burhan and Hemeti knew that, he was in a very weak financial state, which allowed them to start a coup and bring him out of power. And when that happened, it was controlled by a military government. And then those two wanted the resources from Sudan, and therefore they started a war between each other.
Of course, when we speak about Sudan, we have to mention Darfur. And I remember since I was a kid, 6 years old, I turned the TV and it's Darfur.
No.
Because it started since 2002, I think, or 2003, the ethnic cleansing. Can you tell us about the origins of this conflict there? And I think it's until now, the latest war is 2021, 23 also.
And the ethnic cleansings
Mhm.
there.
Right. So you had back then the Janjaweeds who were a part of the ethnic cleansing in Darfur. The ethnic cleansing was targeting African tribes within Darfur. Their motive was to turn Sudan into an Islamic state that was run underneath, that followed the caliphate. This was Omar al-Bashir's intentions, and that's what he wanted to turn Sudan into. So he created these Arab militia groups to go and massacre the African tribes across the Darfur region. And what we're seeing now, or what was happening even when, well, actually it started, like I said, when Abdullah Hamdok was in presidency, like when he was the leader of the civilian council. He was in 2015, the African Union peacekeeping forces were in Darfur and they were protecting the civilians of Darfur. And when he wasn't able to support the African Union peacekeeping forces, he had to pull them out. And basically he had to transition them to an African Union peacekeeping mission using UN Chapter 6. When he decided to do that and started to pursue that, the mission fell through. And the rapid support forces came in and they took control with the Sudanese armed forces. And when that happened in the end of 2020. I was there in 2021. The rapid support forces had full control with the Sudanese armed forces. And they said it was the worst violence they had ever seen since the early 2000s. And they were calculating the amount of attacks that were happening in these very dire localities. And we could tell that it was going to surpass the Darfur genocide in the early 2000s because there was no security. There was nothing to protect people from Darfur. So the rapid support forces were working also with the Janjaweeds, and they were working together to create massacres again on African tribes throughout Darfur. And it started to increase in the early 2000s. Or 2020, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Jordan, the UN humanitarian and emergency relief chief dubbed Sudan one of the worst humanitarian nightmares in recent history. So I wanted to ask you, as a person who has been there for a long time, how does life look like there right now, and how difficult is it to bring some humanitarian aid into the country and distribute it? This is the issue.
Well, right now, no aid is being able to get through the borders in Sudan, especially in Darfur. The only organization that is actually able to get into Sudan and into Darfur is the Red Cross. But other than that, they're not receiving any kind of humanitarian aid. Also, the U.S. sanctions really jeopardized the humanitarian organization, especially the grassroots organizations that were in Sudan. So they had a very hard time distributing aid throughout Darfur. The life there is very difficult. I can't say what life is there, what it's like right now, but when I was there in 2021, you go into Darfur and I was immediately basically detained by the rapid support forces. They took away my documents, my passport, put me in a room, questioned my intentions of why I was there. I had to go under false pretenses. They didn't want me to see what was going on in Darfur if I was a journalist. Mm-hmm. You go inside Darfur, there's no security. There's no international organizations working on the ground there because it is so insecure. You travel along dirt roads, there are no infrastructures, there's no international businesses. You're basically in no man's land that is controlled by militia territories. Mm-hmm. we drove into Greta, which is the front lines of the war in Darfur, and the only security that we had were volunteer men who purchased guns from the black market that really didn't have a strong background into, military combat. But the Janjaweeds and the RSFs were working together to attack the people from in Darfur, and people were scared. People were terrified because we also knew that they were not getting any international support either. There was no international agencies, no international foreigners coming in and asking from political parties, asking what was happening in Darfur during the peace agreement when all this was happening. And they said that there is no, when I was there, they said there's no international foreign policymakers coming into Darfur and asking us what is happening, because if they did, they would be horrified. It was the same exact genocide that was happening in the early 2000s, but was being left ignored in 2020.
Well, obviously, a lot of people are suffering there, and women under horrible conditions. I read in one of your articles that you met with some schoolgirls that you met at Jerida High School. I don't know if I pronounced that right, Jerida. And they were traumatized, and they would go into groups to schools because they were afraid of rape. And it's used by the Janjaweed soldiers as a weapon of war. Can you tell us how it feels to be a woman in Sudan now?
Well, I can per se to say what it must feel like to be a woman in Sudan, but from what I witnessed, women there are very traumatized. They don't, and also there's no trauma centers for women there to talk about the trauma of rape that they are encountering almost on a daily basis. What the Janjaweeds would do they would rape women as they would invade these villages, and they would rape the woman. They would take the underwear off of their body and they would place it on their heads, and they would tie them up to let others know that they have been raped. So the girls at the Greta High School, they would walk in very large groups through militia territories because, numbers and safety, safety is in numbers, and, the larger the group, the safer that they are. But right outside the gated perimeters that we were in, right outside were the Janjaweeds and the RSFs. And they were just raping women on a daily basis. And that was, they wouldn't report it. They couldn't really report it. So the numbers of rapes were not really, weren't actually being, I guess, documented enough.
Yes, whom would they report it to, right? In this situation, I wonder how is the situation in camps. So there are apparently, according to UNHCR, around 8.5 million displaced Sudanese, both internally and externally, in neighboring countries. So Chad, Ethiopia, Eritrea, even. Can you tell us a little bit about their situation inside Sudan? Where are they placed, and can they feel safe in those camps?
So there's 14 million people that are currently displaced in Sudan right now. 8 million people are displaced in Egypt. Around 2.5 people, maybe 3 million people are displaced in Chad, and 2.5 million people are displaced in South Sudan. In South Sudan, the refugee camps there along the border, Rank is one of them, is unlivable. Many people are dying. We know that they said that in Chad, the refugee camps that are in Chad, every 3 kids are dying within every 12 hours from malnutrition. And 12 people are dying a day from malnutrition. There's hardly enough humanitarian aid going into these camps. So the refugee camps that I saw in South Sudan were horrendous. It was, basically there is no room for the amount of refugees that are fleeing across the border. They're sleeping basically on the mud, and catching malaria, catching other diseases that are killing them rapidly. There's not enough food to be distributed into these camps, so they're dying from malnutrition. And they're also catching a lot of diseases from the malnutrition that they're suffering from. Also in Chad, there's not enough resources that are going into the refugee camps in Chad. They're asking for $47 billion of humanitarian aid. They're only receiving $127 million. So it's not enough to be able to feed 400 million people that are now displaced. They're coming in from Al Janin, which is in the West Darfur, and for them to escape from Darfur, they have to cross the border. And when they cross the border, it's basically unlivable. They don't have enough camps. They don't have any place to sleep. They don't have enough resources for them to feed them all. And mind you, kids are not going to school either. There are no resources for kids to go to school. And that is one of the biggest concerns, is that when are they going to be able to receive an education again? So the situation is extremely dire, and it's only getting worse, which is the terrifying part, that there's no way of stopping this war completely anytime soon. And more refugees are going to be trying to trying to cross these borders in order to flee safety, for safety and security. So,
Jordan, you mentioned South Sudan, and it's the world's newest nation. On July 9th, 2011, it became its own country after a decade of civil war and a loss of more than 2 million lives. Did this separation of South Sudan contribute to the state of the country now? And if yes, how?
I wouldn't say that it contributed to the state of the country now. I think that they lost a lot of resources when South Sudan gained its own independence in 2011, because they cut off 90% of their income on oil. They first thought that they would be able to share the oil before they gained their own independence, and the fight was against the oil. When you see the army that you have been fighting against for so many years start to kind of collect themselves around the border, of course tensions are going to be heightened. And they thought that recently, a couple of years ago, that South Sudan and Sudan were going to, start another war with one another. But I would say that it did have a huge impact on Sudan's economy and resources just because of the oil. But then the Sudan also was able to economically fund itself, or the elites of the Arab sovereign council were able to fund themselves through gold mining and exporting gold. That was kind of their new way of income, which they got billions of dollars from. So they didn't necessarily need the oil from South Sudan, but it did make a huge impact on the fact that it did take 90% of their income due to the oil that they cut off.
I read a little bit.
Sudan.
I don't know if you can confirm it, that the Wagner's group, it has a different name now, was very much engaged in extracting resources, predominantly gold, from Sudan. Do you know something more about this? I didn't find much information about it.
Yeah, that's because they started to do that during when the civil war erupted in last April. And mind you, foreign journalists were not allowed into Sudan and journalists that are in Sudan were being killed and were being detained and arrested indefinitely. So a lot of information about the Wagner Group working in Sudan was not really, there wasn't a lot of information coming into the international media, but a lot of researchers were going in and seeing that the Wagner Group were working with the RSFs because the RSF's Hemeti has control over the gold. When al-Bashir elected Hemeti to be one of his military generals, when he was the general for the Janjaweeds, he actually was the one that was controlling the gold, which is why al-Bashir wanted him to be one of his military generals. So the Wagner Group is working with the RSFs because they have more control of the gold and resources in Sudan. And they were exchanging gold and money back and forth. And so that was, something we saw quite a bit before the war, and then once the war started, it started to exasperate a lot more between the two.
We're gonna take a very short break right now, but you definitely must stay with us during this break, especially those who are watching, not only listening to this podcast, because during the break, we're gonna show you a teaser of Jordan's movie, a movie she is working on right now, Sudan's Invisible War. This is what you're gonna see right now.
Also inside this town, there are some militias also attack it with the for the west side and east sides.
Every day, every month, Janjaweed militia attacking Greda. And also every day at night you hear like gun shooting. Every day at night you hear gun shooting.
This is one of the problem led my brother Walidin left the Sudan, because all our village is destroyed. There is no food, there is nothing. For this case, he left the Sudan.
No water, look. This is our suffering.
For this case situation here, very worse, and people living unsafe. But this is the situation, and living like this, always scary, but living because no way and no peace, and nobody protects them.
Welcome back to the second part of the conversation with Jordan Siegel. Jordan, I would like to say congratulations because I watched the trailer. I know you haven't finished it, but it's amazing work, really. And I can't wait to watch it when it's finished.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Jordan, before the break, you mentioned that the sanctions implemented recently, they impacted the humanitarian aid. The leadership of the fighting military forces were sanctioned, some of their mining operations. Do those sanctions have any chance of achieving what they're supposed to achieve, meaning peace in Sudan?
I think they have potential. A lot of the sanctions that were placed on Sudan, I think, were a huge mistake because the U.S., when the war started, they put a sanction on humanitarian aid, which didn't affect these two notorious actors, Al Burhan and Hemeti. because they had their own banking system within the system themselves. So they had billions of dollars in other resources, and they had multilateral deals with other countries. So the U.S. putting sanctions on Sudan and the humanitarian resources only affected the people themselves. It put the innocent civilians in a very, very, very dire state, to the point where it was like inhabitable. Like they couldn't live in Sudan under these sanctions. And so it really didn't affect these two at all. What is now happening is more of like private sanctions on these individuals within their banking systems that they use for the exporting material and gold in the gold mining industry. I mean, this could put economic pressure on them, which then, kind of over time will make them more weaker and weaker and weaker, and they won't be able to have the access to regenerate weapons, and regain their strength and power. And it's also can put them into a political isolation. They won't be able to travel, to different countries and making deals and negotiations with other, and bilateral deals with other countries that they're still allies with. So that can also weaken their position. And it also, threatens those allies that are still signing, on to these two actors, saying if you participate still with them and make agreements, then you too will suffer the impact of the consequences going against these sanctions, which is one of the reasons why you don't really see China as much in Sudan anymore. But there are a lot of dodges that they do use in these tactics. They shift their financial activities to a less regulated market, which is something that they're very good at doing. They're very good at maneuvering the way that they use their money and resources that aren't being able to be regulated by the system or by the U.S. And it also, the multilateral deals and support that they still have with their allies is still very strong. So there's still ways that they can maneuver around these sanctions. But if the U.S. continues to put more pressure on these private sanctions within these two actors, I think it could have some effect, but over time. I think that this should have happened sooner. I think it was the international failure to not place these private sanctions as soon as this war ignited. They waited too long. They waited until the last minute, until they really kind of sanctioned off these two individuals, and not putting it on the civilian, themselves.
It is so, it's a tragedy that it affects civilians so much. There's always this dilemma in humanitarian aid in places like Sudan, places with heavy conflicts. Do we provide aid knowing that a big chunk of this aid will probably go to the military forces, the fighting ones, that we basically have to pay bribes to bring at least a little bit of humanitarian aid? Or shall we cut it off completely and hope that this will somehow limit the conflict, or force those fighting sides to sit at a negotiating table, because they will also run out of food and other resources, right? It's a huge dilemma what to do in this situation.
It is a huge dilemma, but at the same time, the sanctions on humanitarian aid has no effect on these two actors. So they don't obviously care about the civilians. So they can say cut the humanitarian aid, have these people suffer. It's not going to impact us at all. And in fact, they were stealing a lot of the resources, but it wasn't enough for them to could not continue to provide the resources that could have an impact on some of the localities that needed dire humanitarian aid. Like when I was there, you did have refugee camps that were open for humanitarian resources, but they weren't getting hardly any supplies still. Even though there was an open window for them to receive it, they weren't receiving it because of the sanctions. Many of the refugee camps that, or IDP camps, which is internally displaced people, the RSFs would guard the gates, in like preventing any kind of humanitarian aid or access or and reporters to go into the IDP camps, which would cut them off from any kind of resources from the outside. So and they would steal that too. But I think that there was there were a lot of grassroots organizations that were on the ground that were able to collect the funds and humanitarian resources and aid, and they had the knowledge of where these different localities were and how to maneuver aid without having it being stolen by the government. So I think talking to a lot of the grassroots organizations in Sudan that weren't getting enough international support made me realize, okay, maybe with IOM and the UN, yes, a lot of that humanitarian aid could be stolen. But when you go to the grassroots organizations that are on the ground, that aren't providing any sort of like funding or humanitarian resources, that do have the access and do have the ability to reach some of these localities, but aren't receiving it, is a tragedy. It's a complete tragedy and failure to not recognize that.
Yeah, so but the US is trying to have a role in fixing things, and I remember under the Trump administration, the US wanted Sudan to agree to join Israel's Abraham Accords. So how did that go, and how is it now under Biden's?
Um, so that was a huge mistake. I was there in 2021 when the Abraham Accords, started to really take place in Sudan. So the Abraham Accords is to recognize Israel as a Jewish state and to support Israel as a Jewish state. And they wanted the backings of Arab countries to support that. So Sudan was on their list. And Netanyahu would go to Sudan and, at the time, so you had the transitional government happening. You had Abdullah Hamdok that was in the civilian government that was transitioning their power. But at the same time, they were in a very crisis situation because they were suffering from the immense amount of debt because of the previous war. And then you had these two notorious political military leaders that still held their position within the military ranks. They still had their military power. They still controlled the Arabian Sovereign Council. And they were in a transition to work together. And they were trying to work, and that was under the Juba peace agreement, right? So Israel came in at the wrong time, at a very sensitive moment in Sudan. They weren't able to make negotiations with outside actors, foreign actors like Israel or the US to make such deals or to sign on the Abraham Accords because they didn't have an established government yet. So what happened was that, the civilian government, Abdullah Hamdok, would sign for the Abraham Accords. But al-Burhan and Hemeti knew that he was also wanting the international debt relief. And in order to do that, they had to lift the sanctions and they had to take them off the terrorist watch list. And al-Burhan and Hemeti knew that if they waited long enough, Abdullah Hamdok would crumble. He wouldn't be able to stay in power. He would be in such an amount of debt and would lose control of his leadership that they would be able to do another military coup. And that's what they did with the Abraham Accords. So then they were able to do a military coup. And Netanyahu still met with al-Burhan behind closed doors. And we don't know what these deals and negotiations were about because there is no public records about what they were talking about. And even during this time, they're making deals with these two notorious leaders that were causing all these atrocities throughout Darfur. A second genocide was forming, and ethnic cleansing on these African tribes was starting to emerge. Yet they were not being punished for their past history, and also making deals with the U.S. and al-Burhan, or with Netanyahu. Al-Burhan was traveling to the U.S. and he was meeting with Netanyahu, and still we have no idea what these records were about, but it gave them the political backing that they needed. Israel isn't fully responsible, but they gave them the political backing to form a military coup over the civilian government. So, in my opinion, the Abraham Accords in Sudan was a complete failure. and was, was completely in the wrong for trying to push such such pressure on a government that wasn't actually able to really sustain themselves quite yet. It was such a fragile moment for them to step in.
And how is it now under Biden? Is there any change?
You don't see much change happening now because it's just a complete mess. The war is just exasperated to the point where it's really, you can't really control it at this point. I mean, they're trying with sanctions to stop the leaders from, from creating a larger civil war for it to continue to grow. But, and the humanitarian resources are very limited still. So I don't think he's doing enough. I don't think he's putting enough pressure on these notorious actors inside Sudan. Also, we have the situation that's happening in Gaza. And before that was Ukraine. So a lot of the attention is not really being placed in Sudan still. So when you have other countries in geopolitics and geopolitical interests, then it becomes involved. And that's what you also see with Sudan too.
You have an amazing article called Anarchy and Genocide in Sudan, and I quote, you said that this tragedy could have been averted if the international community had supported Sudan's civilian-led government instead of resorting to the Arabian Council. Can you explain to us more about that?
Yeah. So I think when foreign peacemakers go into Sudan wanting to form agreements and alliances and trying to create some sort of peaceful transition, also to try to help them with a peaceful transition within their government, they're not looking at the past history of this kind of pattern that happens over and over and over again within their government. How do these military coups start? Who are those leaders that start the military coup, and how did it get started? Because if they looked at that, they would see that the pattern still exists. They wait for when the civilian government gets weakened, and then the military coup gets taken over by the Arabian Sovereign Council. And when you have these two leaders that obviously have a very, dark history in the past, and they weren't being charged by the ICC, there were the two that were left over. By not carefully walking into the situation and forming deals and alliances and not helping the civilian government at all with the debt relief, they were just kind of allowing for another military coup to happen. What should have happened was they should have helped the debt relief. They should have helped support the African Union peacekeeping forces in Darfur to stay there. Sorry, there's a dog. I don't know if you can hear that. I'll start over for that. What should have happened was that the International Committee should have supported the civilian government more. They should have helped them with the debt relief. They should have supported the African Union peacekeeping forces in Darfur to stay there and to protect the people in Darfur, the tribal communities in Darfur. They shouldn't have allowed them to have to transition to an African Union peacekeeping mission and allowing that to fall through and allowing the rapid support forces to move forward. They should have known the history that this was just going to lead into another civil war. And there were all these things that could have been prevented. But it wasn't, because Abraham, because Hennity had the resources, they had money, and with money comes power, and with power comes control. They had control over the borders of Sudan. So they didn't want migrants to also escape from Sudan and cross into the Mediterranean. And they also had control over the terrorist watch. They were able to give notice if there was any terrorist activities that were happening inside Sudan, the Arabian Council. So Abraham and Hennessy, they were able to give that kind of information to the U.S., which the U.S. wanted. So they'll do anything to keep that relationship flowing and to keep those borders in control as well. So I think that there's a lot to say of the reasons why they decided to, make deals, negotiations with the Abraham Sovereign Council, and not really fully support the civilian government, who were not as rich and who were not as powerful.
Jordan, this region, the Horn of Africa, the Chad Lake area, this is a very unstable part of the world. There are conflicts happening there quite a lot. And actually, Sudan has a long history of also admitting refugees from other countries, not only South Sudan, but also from Chad, Syrians as well. Do you think that this situation right now in Sudan gives a possibility of this turning into a regional conflict and spreading to other countries?
I do. I think that this could spread definitely into Chad. Chad is having a very hard time keeping the borders in control. They don't have enough power. They don't have enough resources if it does spill over into Chad, which I think that's what the U.S. is trying to prevent right now from happening. Is from this, I think it will first start into Chad and move forward from there. I don't think that it could spread into Egypt, or into Libya, but maybe also Libya. But first, I think it would also, if the war was spread into Chad, and that would be a major concern, considering the amount of people that are there fleeing from the war, the millions of people that are there. And I mean, for now, it's more internal and it hasn't spread yet. But it's really hard to say where this war will go. I don't think a lot of people will know until, over time, to see how much is gonna, if it starts to get worse or if it starts to decrease. And once we see it, if it decreases, I think it will just stay within the region. But if it does increase, it's hard to say where exactly this could, spread and who would be involved in it.
I'm having trouble, just understanding why the world is not paying attention to Sudan's situation now with all this chaos there. And I read that you met with some locals in Darfur. They told you that they never see any reporters. And I quote, one of them said, "You're the first one we have met in over a decade." That's 10 years, nobody taken any interest in them. So why this lack of media and attention?
Well, first they had a 10-year media ban, or 15-year media ban. So they weren't allowing foreign journalists to enter into Sudan, or especially in Darfur. I went there right when they lifted the media ban, but they didn't really actually lift it. So I talked to other journalists that had actually went to Darfur as a journalist with the journalist credentials, and they were completely monitored and limited to where they could go. And they were only there for a certain amount of days until the Rapid Support Forces, or the Sudanese armed forces, decide to deport them out of Darfur. So they weren't even allowed to really report fully on, or to stay there with it, more than a week. So they had really limited, even if you had all the proper documents and paperwork, they wouldn't allow you into Darfur, even though they had left the media ban. So I went there under false pretenses. I knew a lot of the rebel forces that were in Darfur, and civilians and community leaders who backed up my visa, my tourist visa. So I was able to enter there more freely than as a journalist. But yeah, a 15-year media ban on journalists entering into Darfur limits us having any kind of access or information with what's happening there. And also journalists that were in Sudan reporting on the situation, other than if they're reporting on the conflict and the corruption, they were immediately killed. If they're reporting on humanitarian issue, it had to be monitored. The Sudanese military has Russian spyware. So they're able to really monitor the information coming out of Darfur, coming out of Sudan. And they're able to target those that are talking and reporting on Sudan's political crisis. And when they're targeted, they're imprisoned indefinitely or they're killed. So it comes to, it's without saying that reporting in Sudan is extremely dangerous. And there is no security there. You're in complete no man's land. So for journalists to gain access to the front lines, it comes with a huge amount of risk, a huge amount of risk.
Yet you managed to work there completely independently as a woman. Sorry for saying this, but it makes a difference also in this situation, given the amount of violence towards women. I mean, probably saying it on behalf of both of us that like it's pretty badass what you did there. But like, how did you manage to, record anything, collect those informations? You made your own movie about that. So how?
Yeah, I mean, I went there with a good networking system. I was connected to some of the rebel groups that had a major influence on my entry into Darfur. I also was connected with the governor of Darfur, Minamanawi. And I had a lot of good connections with tribal leaders that were in Darfur and a lot of the civilian community that were helping me and guiding me to different localities and knowing the safety and the roads that we would drive down to know like exactly, okay, we can't go down this road, we'll go down this road. So they, I traveled with the community, and I traveled with people that I trusted, and I didn't go there with a team. I went there, with a camera, a little, Fuji film camera that looked like a tourist camera, but is completely badass. It has a, 4K HD. And I carried 2 lenses with me. I didn't carry a tripod. I didn't carry lighting. I carried one lighting equipment, but I really limited my equipment to make me look like a tourist. And I was detained when I got there. I was detained by the Rapid Support Forces. They took away my documents, my passport. They put me in a room. They questioned my whereabouts, why I was there. They wanted to deport me. They were like, we're going to deport you. But both times they took the last plane into Darfur. And so they didn't want to deal with me having to go back the next day and like take the next plane back to Khartoum. So they just said, okay, well, when you enter in Darfur, you're on your own. And I was very careful. Like I really trusted the people I was with, and I felt very honored to be accepted into their community. I felt extremely honored. And so when I was able to get that kind of access, it allowed me to go into different locations and localities and to different IDP camps to interview some of them. But I mean, it came with a lot of risk. I mean, I took a picture of the Rapid Support Forces climbing on a bus, and when I photographed them, the next day they came searching for me. They wanted to arrest me because I had taken a picture of them, and they did not want that. And the next day they came out looking for me, wanting to arrest me, but luckily I was on a plane back to Khartoum. So they weren't able to actually catch me at that moment. But it does come with a risk, but I had the honor with having such great connections there. Yeah.
Wow, Jordan, that's quite the story. I mean, I cannot wait to see Sudan's Invisible War. We will recommend it to absolutely everybody once it's out. Thank you very, very much for joining us, for sharing your story, for sharing information about the situation in Sudan. It's extremely precious for us to be able to spread this information farther.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. We would like to have you in Refocus maybe to teach a workshop. Yeah. Douglas,
that would be great.
Can you work on, because we are
I
really
love that.
we are thirsty for knowledge. Really, we have a lot of people. Yeah. We really just want to learn and make ourselves better and be better reporters and show the truth. Yeah, and I think you are very suitable for this job. So I hope you can come.
I think after Jordan's workshop, like everybody will leave Refocus and just go to super dangerous places to record and be as passionate as her.
I hope not, but
we need material. Yeah, we need.
But yeah,
okay.
Thank you. I would love to. That would be
really
amazing. Yeah,
that would be great. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Jordan. Thank you very much to our audience for listening, for watching. We will be back in 2 weeks' time. By that time, I just want to remind you that this project is sponsored by Allianz Foundation and is led by Aperture. Thank you very much and see you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
And Douglas will coordinate with you about the workshop because you said yes. So you are coming definitely.
Okay, I'm gonna come here now and say we have to make this happen.
Yes.
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 Okay, that'll be, yeah.
To do a
Yeah.
workshop with us in some way. And I just also wanted to say thank you for serving as a photo judge in this last cycle.
Yeah, of course.
And we're really excited about announcing that on social media this week now that we have your selections and everyone's super excited about. And we really love the feedback that you provided everyone. So thank you for serving as a
course.
judge and then and supporting the community already. So we're going to keep pushing for more and more and more. So soon, hopefully, we will have you here with us in Athens.
Yes, this is what
That
we
sounds
do.
amazing.
We just force good people to come here and work with us. Guys, come here so that
Yeah.
Jordan can see you.
Yeah,
So
thanks also to our
this is
production
the
team.
admin
Amazing
team's,
production
team.
team.
So this is Ellie.
Ellie Sound.
Ellie.
Hi, Ellie.
Suda.
Suda.
Ellie and Suda are sisters from Iran. And Davud.
Davud.
You're so shy.
No, he just
He's
wants
just
to be
like,
professional.
he's working on the
He wants to put
lens.
everyone in focus. Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone in focus.
Come on, Dawood, I'm going to
Here he is.
and you are here.
Hi.
No, here, that one on the TV.
It was nice to meet you. Yeah.
Nice to meet you. Thank
This
you.
Hope
very
to
young
see you.
face.
What's that?
Hope to see you here, like
I hope-
individual. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're gonna
Yeah.
get
Thank
her,
you so
yeah.
much for your help in making this podcast happen.
And please take care of yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, really.
I will.
Yes.
Yeah.
You too.
Absolutely.
Bye bye.
See you very
Bye.
Thank
See
you,
you
Jordan.
soon.
Bye.
Kisses. Bye bye.
Bye.